afternoon. Welcome to the Leadership Winston-Salem May Leaders in Lunch webinar, Spatial Injustice, Mapping the Path Forward. For those of you who may be less familiar with LWS, we are a nonprofit organization that works with over 100 community leaders each year to educate, connect, and energize them to serve and improve the community. Hosting webinars like this is just one of the ways that we continue to educate our class members and stay connected to our alumni. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker for today's webinar. Dr. Russell Smith is a professor of geography in the Department of History, Politics, and Social Justice at Winston-Salem State University and the founder, faculty lead for the Spatial Justice Studio at the Center for Design Innovation in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He received his doctoral degree in geography from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. His research interests include exploring issues of spatial injustice related to the built environment and local government boundary change. Dr. Smith is the author of numerous research publications, contracted reports, and scholarly and community presentations. In 2018, Dr. Smith published a book titled Municipal Incorporation Activity in the United States, Patterns, People, and Procedures. During his time at Winston-Salem State University, Dr. Smith has been recognized for his dedication to teaching, community and university service, and his research accomplishments. He's received the Wilvaria B. Atkinson Distinguished Research Award in 2023, the Bill Shepard Master Teacher Award in 2019, and the Cedric S. Rodney Distinguished Service Award in 2018. Since 2019, Dr. Smith has also been a Fulbright specialist, specializing in urban planning and is associate partner at the TU Delft Center for the Just City. Prior to joining Winston-Salem State University, Dr. Smith was an AICP certified urban planner for a variety of local governments where he specialized in land use planning and urban redevelopment. Dr. Smith, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a mouthful. I appreciate that warm introduction and glad to be here with everyone today. I was just looking at some of the participants as they're coming in, and some names look familiar. So hopefully this is what I'm talking about today is a project, is a new thing, but it of course comes out of the work of the Spatial Justice Studio. Excuse me. And so I'm looking forward to hopefully sharing some information with you and hopefully getting your interest and engaging you in a new project that we're just kicking off and that we're really excited about for looking at past spatial injustice here in Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, and trying to think about how do we create more sustainable and just neighborhoods and spaces for all the citizens, So I'm really excited to share this message with you today. I've been told that if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat, and either we'll have time at the end, I can reach out and try to respond to them, or as we go along, if I see something and we have a minute and I don't get too sidetracked, I will try to jump on that as well. I also just like to tell people that I'm pretty accessible. So after this conversation, if you want to have other conversations, reach out to me. I'll share some contact information. I'm not really hard to find. You can look up the Spatial Justice Studio website. You can go to WSSU and look up the staff directory. So there's lots of different ways to reach out to me so we can continue conversations. So I think with that, I will see if I can share my screen here, just like how it worked in the preview. And yeah, hopefully you guys can see that now. So I appreciate Leadership Winston inviting me to this Leaders in Lunch and the opportunity to talk today about one particular specific type of spatial injustice, a historical spatial injustice that has to do with deeds and racial covenants that were put on private property. The project is called Mapping Prejudice in Forsyth County, and it actually builds from work from the University of Minnesota. They were the first organization that I know of to complete a project like that. And as a result, we've actually partnered with them, the Spatial Justice Studio, Winston-Salem State. I'm going to share some other community partners. We're actually right now partnering with the University of Minnesota to help us complete a study and create data sets that looks at what I'm getting ready to talk about here in the local context. So if you're interested in seeing a finished product, you could Google mapping prejudice and the University of Minnesota project will come up, and you can kind of see all the things that they did and they continue to do. It's a living project. It's not just we do something and then it's over. If you're not familiar, I like to just give a little bit of background. I know, like I said earlier, some of you, I noticed some names on there, so probably familiar a little bit more with the Spatial Justice Studio, but it is located at something called the Center for Design Innovation, which is a building on right off of Research Parkway, halfway between the School of the Arts and WSSU. It's a shared facility. It's been around for over a decade now, and it's had different purposes. Currently, the studio calls it home. And the Spatial Justice Studio, what we try to do is create partnerships, bring together different groups, faculty, students, community, and then work on solving problems to relate it to how space is used, how space is allocated. Why do we privilege certain neighborhoods, certain communities? Why do we disadvantage others? And so through that process over the years, we've engaged with a wide number of people over the last 6 years in visioning sessions, in planning efforts, in grant writing, in fellowship programming, in student internships. So a lot of different things. We help bring the Undesign the Red Line exhibit, if you were part of that, to the community. I've spoken at many leadership events over the past couple years, give a lot of talks. And then we've also, for the last 3 years, created something called the Forsyth County Neighborhood Opportunity Atlas, fcnoa.org. That's a website that has a lot of useful data that explores spatial attributes at a census tract level across the county. We hope by bringing people together from all these different areas, we can find solutions to problems that have plagued urban areas for decades. I gave a talk at the Fair Housing Summit, I think it was a couple weeks ago now, and I had some questions. And one of the things I raised was, for 60, 70 years, we've been fighting housing issues and food desert issues and poor performing schools. And these are real problems. And I can show the data and we can map it and explore these things. I think two things. One, do we need to ask a different question about those? And do we need to offer different solutions? And I think this project that I'm getting ready to discuss with you tries to do both those things, is to kind of understand the question or the problem from a different angle. And so that we can use research and teaching, and especially the community, who often has the best answers, to make urban spaces more fair, functional, and sustainable for everybody. So that's kind of what we do. There's a website you can visit. We've got a lot of materials. There's some videos. I'm happy, of course, to answer questions about the studio at large. Often people ask me after I say all that, well, what the heck is spatial justice, right? I think it's easier to talk about what spatial injustice is, because that's what we tend to see around us. Some of those examples I listed in the previous slide, or what I talked about in the previous slide, was food deserts, the lack of economic mobility, gentrification, housing segregation. These are all spatially based injustices, right? They don't just randomly appear across the landscape. They actually congregate in certain communities, in certain spaces. So spatial justice, a colleague of mine who is with the Center for the Just City in the Netherlands, who I work with, he said, well, then spatial justice has to be the opposite of that. It has to refer to having access to public goods and basic services and cultural goods and economic opportunities and healthy environments. And we can get that, hopefully, by using fair and inclusive planning, design, and practices. And I say we can get there because what I'm going to talk about today with the Mapping Prejudice Project is that we, as a society, deliberately created just spaces. We deliberately went through policies and programs and funding and a variety of things, legislation, that created the inequalities that we often see across cities and counties all throughout the United States, but also globally. And as a result of that, I think we can fix them. I think we can change them. And so that leads into kind of this conversation about, how does spatial injustice come about? Like, why do we have some neighborhoods that have abundant public goods, services, economic opportunity, a very healthy environment, and others that don't? And the reason is because space, there's two ways to look at space. There's the physical geography, like just how the land is, right? High, low, drains well, has rocky soils, can support a skyscraper, is marshy, right? I mean, those are all physical attributes of space. But then on top of that, we use our social structures, our political, economic, social systems to manipulate space. And something just as simple as zoning that we take for granted, and most cities and most counties have a zoning ordinance that says, hey, we're going to protect people's property values and we're going to protect them from harmful uses by saying some land is zoned business and some is residence and some is industry. But just that process, if I own some land and I get it zoned for commercial and my neighbor gets it zoned for residential, the value that we place on those two properties just by giving it a color on a map has socially impacted the reality, the space, and that land is actually the same in many cases, except for the zoning we put on top, where we provide water and sewer service, where we congregate things that are issues in our community, environmental injustices. So at the end of the day, I think we can create more spatially just geographies if we begin asking questions about who's getting privileges, why do we privilege certain spaces, who's getting maybe dumped on. At the end of the day, there will be some degree of spatial inequality. I mean, at the end, I think that's, that is part of private property. That's part of a capitalistic system. So it's the question that a colleague who's deceased now, a fellow geographer, mentioned is, when do we intervene? When do we say this injustice is so great that we should do something about these spaces? So that combination of that physical reality of the land plus what we do to it as people impacts and creates spatial injustice. And I think, without going too theoretical, I think that's a good way to frame this conversation and to think about, well, what have we done socially over the past years that has created or exacerbated injustices, right? And so when we think about housing and this project that I'm going to introduce to you today, the Mapping Prejudice Project, excuse me, fighting a cold here, it comes from and out of this history of looking at housing and privileging certain areas for white residents at the detriment, for discriminatory purposes, against non-white residents. And so in many cities, especially in the Southeast, and Winston-Salem was one of these, there was a racialized zoning ordinance. So I was just talking about zoning, and zoning today doesn't say who can live in certain areas, but the one in 1910 did. There were certain zoning districts for white residents and for black residents, and that was ruled unconstitutional in 1918 across the country. Then we had the federal government program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was well-intentioned, trying to keep people in their homes. But to limit the risk, they created redlining maps and said, well, you know what? Certain communities, the black ones, we're not going to provide government funding to keep people in houses there because it's too risky of a financial proposition. Federal government got involved in who received mortgages. Subdivision regulations and the guidelines that the federal government promulgated across the country said, hey, you should limit who lives in these new neighborhoods, these new suburban neighborhoods, to white residents. Public housing projects, most people don't know, but most cities had white and black separate public housing projects that were federally funded to segregate populations. I highlight covenants and deed restrictions because for a period of about 40, 50 years, that was a way that the private sector jumped in. And as things got ruled unconstitutional, as court cases got decided, and the government, state, federal, local, got out of this discriminatory process of housing, the private sector jumped in and said, well, okay, if I can't have a zoning ordinance that does it, I'll just put some language on my deed that I sell to people when they buy property from me. And then we went through urban renewal. We can think about 52, 29 in Greensboro. Cities all across the country have projects that segregated, that separated, that divided, that created just spaces for some population and unjust spaces for others. Today, institutional racism, exclusionary zoning still carry these discriminatory practices with them through to today. So it's not just history. There are things still today that are resonating, that still reinforce. We might not have specific language that prevents minorities from living in places, but race and income are correlated in this country. And so we are more economically segregated because whites tend to have more wealth and as a result can afford bigger and more expensive houses, and other minority groups cannot. So all these things lead to this conversation about how and why is the city that we live in look the way it does. And so this Mapping Prejudice in Forsyth County project, which began back at the beginning of the year, but we're rolling out publicly beginning this week. I gave a presentation to a subcommittee of the City Council of Winston-Salem on Monday. I talked, as I mentioned, at the Fair Housing Summit. We're kind of taking the show on the road to drum up support about this project. It begins in earnest in the fall, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But what we're trying to do is uncover the hidden histories of discriminatory practices in housing through the use of old property records, using deeds that are recorded at the county that exist still today, that include restrictions on the deed of who might live in a place or a racial covenant. And those covenants were put on the deeds and traveled and transferred from property to property owner every time it was sold. That kept certain people out of certain neighborhoods. Understanding this history helps us think about, well, why are certain neighborhoods whiter or blacker, or, over time? What has happened? Well, there were all these policies on the previous slide, plus then the land itself had restrictions on it that segregated people. Hopefully, by shining light on these injustices, these practices, we're helping everyone understand what happened, think about why the spaces we have today are the way they are, and then think about, well, if this was done to create this, what can be done to uncreate it? What can be done to fix it? What can be done to create sustainable, just communities, regardless of people's race, moving forward today? Here's that link I mentioned earlier on the slide that takes you to the Mapping Prejudice project at the University of Minnesota, which is, 5 or 6 years ahead of us in the project. Excuse me. So the process, so what we're doing is we're actually, and we've already done this, we have a hard drive that has every deed recorded in Forsyth County from 1900 to 1970. It's a lot of documents. And the University of Minnesota will take that data and run it through something called a deed machine. And that deed machine looks for, using data science, AI, looks for key terms, words. It's been taught kind of a language to try to identify and weed out the deeds that might have these prejudicial statements in them. We don't want to look at every single deed one at a time. That would take a really, really long time. And so there have about 1 million pages of documents, and we're hoping to narrow it down to like 200,000. And of those, we know not every single one of those, just because the computer spits it out, has a restriction on it, because the computer doesn't understand that, it might flag one of these deeds and say, well, this deed has language in it that's prejudicial because it says the word white. Well, guess what? The property is on White Street, or an owner of the property's last name was White. So we are in the process of going through, we've collected, we're analyzing the data. The next step, and why we're talking to you today, and what we really want to engage the community, the broad community with, is how then do we get eyes and eyeballs and people interested in helping us through community engagement, education, and participatory research, looking at all these deeds and going through them and determining which ones are accurately depicted as prejudicial, where they're located, who owned it, who bought it, if there's history around it that we can find. And so this is a real community-based research effort. This is not a professor sitting in the library for 2 years, turning pages, scribbling notes. This is a crowdsourced effort. We're actually going to use something called the Zoomiverse. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it, but it's an online platform where people can engage with these documents. We've had conversations already with the public school system, all the universities in the county, many churches, to help host events where we will bring the data to an event. We'll have a dinner, and then we'll ask people to actually engage in the process of research. So if you ever want to be a researcher, if you ever want to participate in doing, I'm going to put in quotes, academic research, we invite you to be part of this. And that process is going to begin in earnest in September. We will have the data back from Minnesota over the summer. And then beginning in September, we're going to roll out these standing and special workshops. We're going to have like a standing one that'll be every month at the library people can come to, and then we're going to be on call where we can come to your business, to your church, to your nonprofit, to your school, whatever it might be, to help us go through all of these documents, collect the data, map the data, and also an important part of this is collect conversations. We're partnering with Muse, and they're going to interview and collect people's stories who might have had family that were developers and put deed restrictions on their properties, or might have been someone who wanted to, their grandfather tried to buy in a certain neighborhood and were prevented from doing that. So this is all part of this process. And we think, I keep saying 2 years. Everyone tells me it's going to be quicker than that, but it's only as quick as the volunteer work goes, right? Because we have so many documents. Every document has to be reviewed 5 times. That's going to take some lifting. And we do have student interns from Wake, from Winston-Salem State, that are also working on this project with us. They help create this presentation. I'm going to share a link to a website. They help create that website. So there's ways to engage with it. And then the last part of this phase 3, is I don't see the project stopping with just once we have the data, once we analyze the data, once we map the data, and there you can see, okay, these parts of Winston didn't prevent African-American people from living in them because of these restrictions. And isn't that interesting? And then you look at the redlining map and, oh, that's interesting. And okay, yeah, wow, okay, I understand now what happened. And thank you. No, I want to have this conversation about how do we advocate? How do we empower? What can we do today? Is there a will? And I've talked to several foundations to generate a pool of money to begin tackling issues in communities that were disadvantaged by these processes. Can we improve infrastructure? Can we improve schools? Can we improve housing? What can we do to communities that were basically left behind as a result of these issues, to make a change for today? And I say that because I think a lot of people think geography is static. Professor of geography, oh yeah, that's where the city is and that's the country, and kind of boring stuff. But geography is not static. Neighborhoods change constantly. Communities change. Just look at downtown. If you've been in this community any length of time, downtown is a completely different place than it was 15, 20 years ago. You can argue what you like, what you don't like about it. Was some of it gentrified? But it has changed. And it changed because community, public will, and private sector came together to make a change. We can do that in other spaces across our community. So the goal is to continue to use this as a platform to push for more spatial justice in places that have been unfairly treated in the past. So I mentioned some of these things. Some of the deliverables we're going to have is there'll be a website, and there's a link that either will go in the chat or can go in the chat. The project will have maps. There's going to be volunteer opportunities. There's going to be a collection of stories to highlight local people and residents and families' impact that they felt because of these things. One of the other side things that's going on in the state of North Carolina is the potential for, if you own a piece of property that has this language in it that says this property can only be conveyed to people of the Caucasian race, that's a common thing, or no one, or Negroes or African American or Black residents may not purchase nor live in any of these properties. That's kind of the language on some of these documents we see. And you want to remove that. What's the process for removing it? And it's kind of a double-edged sword there about, do we want it removed or not? Because that's history. And so what we're doing actually through this process is cataloging that history, so that I think it makes it a little bit easier if people do want to remove it, because we're going to still have the data. We're going to have the raw data that shows where it was, where these things happened, who it happened to, and why. And then, of course, I mentioned this idea of creating this community fund, which I'm talking with, which is bigger than this project, but is kind of a cross-section of community people that are interested in housing issues locally here in Winston-Salem and in certain neighborhoods. There is no single path, right? I think this is part of the city council has acknowledged the need for more reparative, restorative processes. This is one of them. I presented that to the council, as I mentioned, on Monday, and I think I received pretty unanimous support there at that meeting. These things, while still not enforceable, still impact the way our communities develop today, and why people might want to get involved. What this idea of no single path is, well, maybe it's about acknowledging and teaching a history that some people would rather forget. Maybe it's finding your own way to navigate the uncomfortable conversations about why our city is segregated. Maybe it's to generate political will for some form of reparations for communities. Challenging structural racism, the fact that history is under siege and we'd like to bury some of these things, to get rid of the covenants, to get your neighborhood involved. Maybe you live in a community that had these discharges, but now it's a very mixed community. So all these different things are potential reasons or calls for you to engage with the project. These are some of our partners. So we've had a steering committee meeting once a month since January to kind of push the project forward. I'm speaking to you as a professor at WSSU and this guy connected to the Spatial Justice Studio, but this project isn't like a WSSU project, and it's a community project. The only way this project is going to work is that if we get people helping all different ages from all across this community, different neighborhoods, different private sector, public, nonprofit. And so we have a good core of people that are helping lead and make decisions and make sure that we're headed in the right direction and having conversations with the people that need to have conversations with, like you here today. But we need more help. We need more partners. We need people, volunteers. We need people willing to host events where we can talk about this and people can actually do some of the hands-on research work that we're calling for with this conversation today. I think, at the end of the day, kind of includes closing, and then I want to show the website a little bit and get to a couple things before we have questions. Let's remember that uncovering and addressing prejudice isn't just about the past, it's about also the future, that these patterns that were put in place over decades persist today for decades more, right? I think one of the things I learned from talking to the people in Minnesota also is that bringing people together and having these honest but hard conversations about what happened is a way to break down barriers that exist today, right? You might not have lived in Forsyth County when there was a deed restriction in your neighborhood or the house you own, right? But it happened and you're there and having a conversation with someone across the table while we're doing this who lives in a different part of town that didn't have that opportunity, that was and those are the things that move the needle. That's what gets people moving forward. That's what gets community to come together. And so this idea of being able to continue to learn and advocate and take action, I think is important. And this is a methodology. This is a vehicle for which we can do that by making all of Winston-Salem more equitable. I gave a talk, and I'm not going to say any names, but I gave a talk at Wake Forest not too long ago, just about spatial justice. And I mentioned this project. And one of the students who was from New Jersey said to me, at the end, she's like, I have one question. I said, yeah. She goes, how do I get my parents interested in stuff like this? All they care about is money. And that's how she said it. It was really blunt. And I said to her, I said, one of the ways to think about it, everyone has a different reason for getting involved in different causes and events. But it's, it affects their local community. So that's one thing. I said, but financially, if spaces that are right now disadvantaged because maybe the housing isn't up to par, or maybe the school that they feed into in that neighborhood isn't the best, or maybe it doesn't have access to grocery stores, and things that people are looking for. If those communities could be improved and became more sustainable, generated additional tax revenue, other spaces could then potentially have a burden lifted from them as well. And so I think there's some of this, we're all in this together, right? It's this idea of being equitable and sustainable. It's not a zero-sum game where somebody wins and someone loses, right? Adding a grocery store to a part of town that doesn't have a grocery store can help the whole community. And creating wealth in communities that don't have it can help across the whole community. So this win or lose, I think, model that maybe we push towards or have been pushed towards needs to be rethought and explored and kind of questioned in my opinion. So you might say, I've asked you to help me several times. How do I help? Well, you can scan this QR code. You can email me. You can call me. The QR code will take you to a volunteer intake form, and that intake form will let you request information. It'll actually let you say, we'd like to host a presentation. If you want to volunteer, donate time, materials, efforts. If you want to tell us, hey, you should be speaking to this group, any of that can be done through the QR code on your screen, or as well as emailing me directly. And I'm happy to respond to those requests. as we get those. Again, this summer we're using for planning to finalize the data analysis, and then the goal is fall kickstart with many community meetings, talking to a lot of different groups, and getting them to engage hands-on with the deeds, with these restrictions, and collecting the data we need to complete the project. So I'm going to stop that for a second and reshare my screen on one other thing I just want to share with you, and then I'm happy to tackle a whole bunch of questions that I think might be in there. So this is the website that were generated, and hopefully by Monday you'll be able to access it directly through the Spatial Justice Studio website. We're doing that right now, but we kind of created a separate one standalone. But you can come down here, and there's some information about examples of restrictive covenants in our community. You can see some of the examples here. These kind of very old-looking documents. Here's some highlighted, text that you can find that talks about what these things look like and how they exist. And then you can also go here to volunteer. If you didn't, this takes you directly to that form where the QR code that I mentioned earlier. So you can fill that out. We've got some resources. You can look at it. Here's a one-page flyer if you want to get people to share something with someone. A little one-pager. This is a little bit longer presentation like the one I just shared. And here's a story if you're interested in media. WFTD just interviewed me the other day. And so we have a radio with a little bit of text story that is linked through there. So I'm going to stop that share. And then I hope we have plenty of time for conversation about spatial justice, about this project. You guys, let me know. And maybe do I look in the chat, Frida, or do you want to pitch me? Or has people asked any questions?
Yes, Dr. Smith, they have. I actually am sending one over to you just so you can have it directly, but I will read the text out
Thanks.
loud here,
Okay.
so that everyone can hear what the question was. The question was, I'm not sure if this is directly related to your focus, but I'm curious as to what you think about it. I received a letter from Duke Energy regarding the conversion of a Catawba County coal burning power plant to natural gas burning. With NC's past investment in sustainable energy sources like solar and wind, I was very surprised to hear about the investment in natural gas. My concern is that this will continue to pollute the local area where the plant is located and contribute to the production of more greenhouse gases. What are your thoughts regarding equitable energy use, and what can we do to switch to more sustainable energy sources?
Yeah, no, not direct. I mean, of course, energy equity and moving towards, climate change disproportionately is going to affect poor minority populations, partly a little bit given to the physical geography of where those people live in low-lying areas that are more prone to flooding, lack of tree canopy in areas. So the heat from summer sun exposure is going to be higher. So yes, it does relate, in my opinion, to spatial injustices. I think to your point is, there is this move, and I think I just heard something the other day that for the first time the world had, I think it was 25% of its energy produced by renewables, which, it's not 100%, but 25% is better than what it was decades ago, that we're moving. But as we move, and populations, especially in growing areas, so you think about the Southeast and the number of people that are moving here that want to live here, local utility providers are looking for ways to make sure they can produce energy. And so I think you're still going to see, I would doubt you're going to see coal anymore, but I think this natural gas, which is, not the best, but not as bad as a coal burning fire plant, is going to be a stopgap as we continue to move towards sustainables. I think to answer the question about what we can do, you can, lobby. I mean, that's the best thing to do, is talk to elected officials, talk to utility providers, tell them what you want. There's the potential for at-home solar. Kind of put your money where your mouth is to make changes to the system. But I think it's something that is going to happen over time, and it is moving in the right direction, probably just not quick enough for all of us.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, I've got another question here, and I'm going to read it out loud. I'm sending it to you in the chat. But it is, I am a new entrepreneurship professor and was wondering if you had any suggestions for how I could incorporate this information into my classes. I have a bit of flexibility. And that question is from Ariel Smith.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks. We are actively looking to bring this project to, and so I'll answer this question a couple different ways. The project itself, I think, can be incorporated into lots of different curriculum. Later in the summer, I'm going to be talking to all the social studies teachers in the Winston-Salem Forsyth County to try to have a day or two where they incorporate this into the kind of the local history element of either like a human geo class or social studies. But I think there's a business component. I hear entrepreneurship. I mean, the thing I immediately think of is that, we're talking about the market, and the market had impacted, populations and limited who could buy property where. And so the whole conversation about, free market, is it a free market? How regulated it is? What did preventing some minority populations from potentially purchasing lands in parts of the city, did that have a detrimental impact on those neighborhoods in terms of property values? So I think once we have some data available to analyze, there's a lot of different ways, and with the real estate angle, I think this could go. As well as, I'm all for, I think just sometimes it's good to just have students in any discipline engage with something that maybe they normally wouldn't run across. And so I'd be happy to come to a class and just say, hey, here's what this is. Here's what happened. Help us look at some of these documents, and you make a decision on whether this one here is an example of what we're looking for or not, and actually get their hands dirty with the material. I hope that answered the question. And please feel free to reach out to me separately after any which way. Are there other questions or?
I am looking in the chat function right now, and I don't see any questions. I do have a question though that I would like to pose. How do you propose that people engage right now? I know you've given us ways that we can do so once the data has been analyzed, but
Right.
how can we start to start having conversations immediately?
Great question. And this is the larger conversation about, I think, one of the things as I've talked to elected officials and, planning staffs and neighborhoods is that I think people would be wise to start just thinking about spatial justice in any decision that they're making. Let's face it, pretty much everything has a spatial component to it, right? And so what I'm getting at is that we tend to take for granted what the market wants to give us. Like, oh, this neighborhood's getting another grocery store. And okay, does anybody come to the meeting to complain about it? If no one complains, then we approve it. That neighborhood's got another grocery store. And over here, we're going to get another fast food. We need to start thinking more holistically and sustainably about, do we need these things in the spaces in which they want to go? And making harder planning related decisions of saying, there's a part of Winston-Salem that everyone knows that has several grocery stores in close proximity to one another. And I mean, that's fine, but we know we have other parts of our community that travel great distances to have access to healthy food options. And do we need that many grocery stores in one area? Clearly, the market says that's what they want, but does the community want to support that? Can we say no to a rezoning? Can we go to council meetings and say no? So this idea of elevating the conversation about not just taking what is given to us, but actually demanding changes. And then the other part of the conversation, I think, is these spaces that have been disadvantaged, these poor, economically distressed communities, often minority communities, neighborhoods. How do we address issues there without displacing people? The United States planning, and I was a planner, we do a great job of development. We know how to build stuff. We know how to rip stuff down. But how do we take existing spaces and improve them and make them more equitable and sustainable and keep the populations that are there? Our view of success often is jaded by profitability, that how much money did the project make? And maybe success, we can measure success by how many people got to stay in their neighborhood and now live in a better accommodation, or the school that's in that neighborhood is doing better, or they have access to food. So again, that's getting back to asking different questions to get different answers, right? Maybe it's not always just about how much does something make or or how much money did it lose, but how much did it improve a space? How much did it improve people? Because if we keep just going off the existing model, we're going to continue to just see the patterns we have. Because for 60, 70 years of using kind of a profitability model to measure success, we're kind of stuck in this space where, maybe half, 2/3 of the community is doing really well, and a third or less is not doing well, and that doesn't really change. We had a conversation at the Fair Housing about poverty levels, 10-15%, and it's been that way for decades. Maybe we're just good with that much poverty? Like, do we really want to tackle poverty? Do we want to get rid of poverty, or are we just happy with that amount of poverty in our community? And so these are tough questions. I'm not trying to sit up here and say I have all the answers, or it's going to be easy. I'm just saying, after all the amount of time that we've spent tackling things in our community, maybe we need to be thinking, one, asking different questions, and two, measuring success differently. Back at a presentation I gave for Leadership Winston-Salem back in, I guess it was in January. It was a cold day, January, February. I showed a slide, and that slide had a map, and it showed, income levels, two different census tracts, east and west of downtown, and one showed $150,000 income, and another one showed $15,000. And housing values, $800,000 houses over here and $70,000 houses over here. And everyone's like, okay, well, yeah, some people make more money, have more education, went to school, work hard or whatever. Other people don't. And then the next slide I show is life expectancy in those two neighborhoods. And the wealthier neighborhood, which happens to be whiter, people live to be 82. The poorer neighborhood that tends to be minority, mostly African American, people live to be 68. That's more than a decade of life lost just based on your geography. So success there wouldn't be just generating more wealth for that community. It would be getting people to healthier life outcomes. Like, how do we make the neighborhood safer so people can exercise more, and the healthy food option, and access to healthcare, all those things. It doesn't always just have to be, let's give people more money and let's make houses more valuable. Let's do some other things and measure success in different ways.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. That was thank you for that answer.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. But a new way to think about things in terms of asking different questions. Another question that has come in from the chat from former Representative Terry, who is also an LWS alum. Is anyone familiar with PAV, a new HUD initiative? Are you familiar with that, Dr. Smith?
And what were those initials? One more time, sorry.
PAV, so PAV,
yeah,
a new HUD initiative.
That has not come across anything that I have been in contact with, so I can't speak to that. If anyone on the call, well, you're the moderator, you tell me how you want to handle, but no, I'm not familiar with that.
Representative Terry, I've actually made it so that you can talk if you like, so you can jump in here, and while that is happening, there is another question that has come in. This one came into me directly. What other organizations in the country are doing work like this? You mentioned the group in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, but is there anyone else that you are aware of?
Do we want Representative Terry to talk first? I'm happy to defer.
I don't know if she's able. Jerry, you're going to have to help me with seeing if that capability, it allowed her that capability. I think we want to answer this question first about other other organizations doing this work while we work on that.
Yeah, so I will say a couple things. Spatial justice and that idea of spatial and what the studio is founded on is not a widely used term nor accepted practice across, I would say, the United States and Canada. Definitely, people are much more familiar with the idea of spatial justice in Europe and South America. I'm going at the end of June to help deliver a 2-week summer school course in the Netherlands focused for master's students in planning on spatial justice. And it includes 100 students from all continents. So Asia is represented, Africa, South America, North America, Europe, Australia. And so I say that with, that maybe you don't hear the term spatial justice very often, or groups specifically saying spatial justice, but there are a lot of groups that are interested in sustainable practices. They're interested in equitable solutions. And so we are seeing more things around like restorative planning. That's another mechanism, another idea that's kind of related to all these things. So those things are growing. But to my knowledge, I think the Spatial Justice Studios, and we were recognized this a couple years back for being a very innovative thing in a publication that included a center at Stanford and one at Harvard. And so it was very, very humbling to be set in the same breath as those ones, because we're kind of delivering unique perspective to these issues that have existed for decades, right? Spatial injustice has been around as long as people have, used land. We're just giving it a vocabulary that resonates with the times, I think. And then the second question, or the second part of that, and I will say, is the Mapping Prejudice project in particular is something that is being replicated, that you can Google and find. I'm actually working with some Register of Deeds in Wake County, in Durham County, in Guilford, that are interested or in some beginning forms of thinking about doing this same thing in their area. And Durham's a little bit further ahead. Wake is doing a complete volunteer, like people come in and look at the deeds one at a time, and with a group, which is going to take a long time. So there are other efforts around the country focused on exploring and unearthing this history of using deed restrictions and racial covenants to limit property. So I think I see in the chat that Representative Terry is mic is on and has shared some documents. So I'm going to be quiet.
Actually, Dr. Smith, that is me sharing these websites that I have found, and I'm not sure if she's going to be able to speak. Representative Terry, are you there? And she might not be able to. Well, I found these websites while you were speaking, and I have some. I can read basically what it is. PAVE is a first of its kind interagency task force dedicated to ending bias in home valuation. The task force includes 13 federal agencies and offices and is chaired by HUD and the White House Domestic Policy Council. So that is what PAVE is. And there's links and plans in the chat.
No, that's great. Yeah, thanks for the link. I just clicked on it. And yeah, we just actually last semester I taught a class on urban geography and had some students research and found there's been numerous studies in the past. I'm familiar, they brought up one in Baltimore, another in California, in which property owners pretend to own a house who are white, and then pretend to own a house who are African American, and bring in appraisers, and the value of the property, the same house, just having two different people own, different races own, if you will, generated vastly different appraisal costs. I think it was maybe 7-8 years ago with the reevaluation here locally. There was a lot of concern about how properties are valued east of 52 as well. So that's an interesting initiative that I was not aware of. So thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Dr. Smith, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but there are some sentiments that thank you. This was a great talk, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. The information you're putting out is very helpful, and thank you, and people echoing those sentiments. So, Dr. Smith, thank you on behalf of Leadership Winston-Salem and our community. Thank you for your time today and presenting to our group and sharing the spatial injustice story of Forsyth County. We're going to end the webinar here, but some last messages. It is recruitment season at Leadership Winston-Salem. If this webinar struck a chord with you and you'd like to know more about what we do and why all of your friends have gone through Leadership Winston-Salem, please register for an information session. Jared will be putting the link to register in the chat now. If you already know that you want to be a member of the LWS family and you're ready to apply, you can find the link to our application on the website and in the chat as well. I will ask my screen so you can hear the person talking. If you're an alum and you know someone who would love to earn their community MBA, please go to our website and click the Nominate the Candidate button or access it through the link that's been put in the chat. It's just a reminder, LWS is a nonprofit organization that relies heavily on the support of individual donors and corporate sponsors to provide the array of programming that we do. If you enjoyed what was offered today, please make a contribution to the organization on our website by clicking the donate link button that you can find in the chat. If you are an alum of LWS, please consider yourself officially invited to Celebration 2024 on June 6th at the Millennium Event Center from 5 to 8 p.m. It is our 40th anniversary year, and our event is going to be particularly wonderful and we would love to see you there. To purchase a ticket, please use the link that Jared is putting in the chat or go to our website and click the link for celebration tickets. Thank you all so much for caring about our community and joining us today for this important conversation. We hope to see you again soon. And thank you again, Dr. Smith, for presenting to us and presenting to the class of 2024. Your presentations are always very insightful, and we appreciate the work you're doing in our community.
Thanks. I appreciate
Thank you so
everyone's
much, everyone.
sentiments, and feel free to reach out to me if anyone has further questions, and look forward to catching up with many of you in the future.
Thank you. Have a lovely rest of the day, everyone.